Then 27 years ago, an entire class vanished into thin air. And now, one survivor is finally ready to break the silence. Margaret Lane awoke with a familiar heaviness in her chest. The morning light creeping through the curtains was dull and grey, matching the overcast sky outside. It was September 28th, a date that had been etched into her bones like a scar. 27 years. 27 long years since her daughter Emily had vanished on a school trip and never come home. She lay in bed for a moment, letting the silence settle over her like a heavy quilt. No birdsong, no chatter from the street, just the soft tick of the clock on the wall and the thrum of her own heartbeat, steady but tired. Slowly, she sat up and reached for the framed photo that hung on the corner of her vanity mirror. It was a close-up of Emily in her school uniform, her brown hair tucked neatly behind her ears, her smile wide and unburdened. Margaret touched the glass gently, her fingers trembling. "Oh, Emily," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It never gets easier." For a moment, the sorrow threatened to pull her under, like it had so many times before. But she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and steadied herself. She had learned to manage the grief, to place it on a shelf when needed. Still, this day always shook her to her core. After washing her face and dressing in a soft grey sweater and slacks, Margaret checked her phone. A message blinked on the screen, simple but comforting. "You're not alone today. Come by if you need to." Evelyn. Evelyn Brooks had been a lifeline through it all. Her daughter, Grace, had disappeared with Emily on the same trip. Over the years, their friendship had grown into something almost sacred, a quiet sisterhood forged in grief. Without replying just yet, Margaret went to the kitchen and carefully gathered a few small gifts, packets of Earl Grey lavender tea and a jar of her homemade lemon cookies. Even after decades of friendship, it felt wrong to show up empty-handed. She slipped on her coat, tucked the cookies into her bag, and stepped outside. The neighborhood had changed very little in 27 years. The same tall oaks lined the streets. The same mailboxes stood in front of the same modest homes. But her world had changed irrevocably. Where once there had been laughter, there was now an empty room. Where once there had been a future, there were only questions. The short walk to Evelyn's house stirred memories with every step. She passed the corner where Emily used to wait for the school bus, her pink backpack slung over her shoulder. She passed the park where they'd once spent Sunday afternoons with kites and sandwiches. Now, it was all quiet. Still. Before she could even knock, Evelyn opened the door, her soft features already warmed with understanding. She wrapped Margaret in a hug that spoke louder than any words. "Come in," Evelyn said gently, stepping aside. Margaret handed her the tea and cookies, and the two women made their way into the cozy kitchen. The smell of cinnamon lingered in the air, and a kettle was already on the stove. Margaret settled into the familiar spot on the worn sofa as Evelyn poured the hot water into 2 ceramic mugs. "How are you doing today?" Evelyn asked, handing her a cup. Margaret sighed, staring down at the steam rising from the tea. "You know how it is. This day is always the hardest. I tell myself it's just a date, but my heart doesn't listen." Evelyn nodded solemnly. "I understand. I still see her in my dreams sometimes. Grace, I mean. And when I wake up, I have to relive it all over again." The two women sat in silence for a moment, sipping their tea letting the aroma soothe the raw edges of memory. Outside, the clouds thickened, casting the room in a soft, muted light. "My therapist said something once," Evelyn said, breaking the quiet. "She told me that grief never leaves. We just learn how to carry it better." Margaret nodded. "Some days, I think I'm doing all right, and then I see her picture or hear a child's laugh, and it hits me like it's day one all over again." Evelyn reached out and placed a hand over hers. "You've been so strong, Margaret, stronger than most." Margaret shook her head. "No. I've just become skilled at hiding it." They talked for a while longer about their gardens, their aging joints, the quietness of retired life. But no matter how far the conversation wandered, it always found its way back to Emily and Grace. Their absence was a presence of its own, silent but undeniable. Eventually, Evelyn pulled out an old photo album from a cabinet near the television. "I thought maybe today we could look through some of these," she said. "Remember them the way they were." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." They sat together on the sofa, shoulders brushing, as page after page of memories unfolded before them. Birthday parties, school plays, sleepovers, the girls in their matching school uniforms, grinning with missing teeth and carefree joy. Margaret smiled through her tears. "Do you remember this?" Evelyn pointed to a photo of the girls building a volcano model for science class. Margaret laughed softly. "They made a mess of my kitchen that day. Red food coloring everywhere. Grace told me she wanted to be a geologist after that," Evelyn said, with a bittersweet smile. As they flipped through more photos, Margaret's gaze fell on a picture she hadn't seen before. It was a group shot from the science fair, with the children gathered around their projects. There, standing slightly to the side, was Principal Dorothy Langford, her brow furrowed. "I thought it was just Mr. Thomas and a staff member who went on the trip," Margaret murmured, more to herself than to Evelyn. Evelyn glanced over. "That's what I remember too." Margaret stared at the image, the faces frozen in time, and a chill crept up her spine. It was a small detail, a shadow in the corner, but something about it tugged at her, unsettled her. For the first time in years, Margaret Lane felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. Doubt, and beneath it, just faintly, hope. The photo sat between them like a relic that didn't quite belong. Margaret Lane leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she took in every inch of the image. It was an ordinary picture on the surface, a group of fifth graders at the school science fair, bright-eyed and eager, standing proudly beside their homemade volcano and solar system models. But just to the left, partially obscured behind a cardboard trifold display, stood a figure that made Margaret's stomach tighten. Principal Dorothy Langford. Her mind reeled. That wasn't right. "I thought Principal Langford didn't go on the trip," she said quietly, tapping the corner of the photo with her finger. "It was supposed to be Mr. Thomas and someone from admin, wasn't it?" Evelyn Brooks shifted beside her on the couch, peering closer. "That's what I remember too. I always thought Dorothy stayed behind that day. I even remember her offering her condolences at the school afterward. She said she wished she could have been there." Margaret's pulse picked up. "Then why is she in this photo?" Evelyn looked thoughtful. "Maybe it was taken before they left, during the fair itself, not the trip." But Margaret wasn't convinced. Something about the image nagged at her, like a loose thread on a sweater that once pulled might unravel everything. The children were wearing the same clothes she remembered from the day they boarded the yellow school bus. The same windbreakers, the same excited grins, and the backdrop. Margaret squinted. Was that the school parking lot? Or was it the roadside rest stop where they'd reportedly taken a bathroom break? Suddenly, the memory returned like a flash of lightning. She had packed Emily's raincoat that day. The forecast had called for light showers, and there it was, hanging off Emily's arm in the photo. A yellow slicker she'd only put on once they were boarding the bus. Not during the fair, not at school. This picture was taken that morning, Margaret murmured. Just before they left. Evelyn's expression darkened. Are you sure? Margaret nodded slowly. I remember the coat. Emily hated it. She wouldn't have worn it unless she absolutely had to. For a few seconds, neither woman said a word. The air seemed thicker, heavier. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the windows. Maybe Dorothy just came out to wave them off, Evelyn offered, her voice softer now, more uncertain. You know how involved she always was. Maybe she stopped by for a quick photo and then went back inside. But Margaret didn't answer right away. Her mind was no longer in the room. It had jumped back 27 years to the meeting in the school auditorium, where parents sat in shocked silence as the authorities gave their first official statement. She remembered raising her hand, asking why Principal Langford hadn't gone on the trip. The officer at the time had answered plainly. She had a scheduling conflict that morning, so the assistant administrator accompanied the teacher instead. It had never occurred to her to question it. Until now. Her fingers gripped the edge of the photo, careful not to crumple it. This changes things, Margaret said finally. I don't know how, but it does. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. Margaret, I know that look. We've been here before, remember? Little details that seemed off. Possible leads that went nowhere. I don't want to see you spiral again. Margaret nodded. I know I've gone down rabbit holes before, but this feels different. It's not something someone told me. It's right here, in black and white. Evelyn placed her cup on the coffee table, the clink of porcelain on wood, louder than it should have been. Okay, she said slowly. Let's think it through. If Dorothy was on that trip, why would she lie about it? What would she have to gain? I don't know, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But if she was there, and she's hidden it for this long, it can't be innocent. They sat in silence, the photo album resting open in Margaret's lap. She could feel Evelyn's eyes on her, searching her face for signs of obsession, of old wounds reopening. But this wasn't the same as before. Margaret had spent years chasing shadows, rumors of sightings, misheard conversations, dead-end tips from strangers. This was different. This was a photo, a moment caught in time. She took a deep breath. I need to talk to her. Evelyn blinked. Talk to Dorothy? Yes? After all these years? She still lives in the neighborhood, doesn't she? Evelyn nodded slowly. As far as I know, yes. Just 2 streets over. But Margaret... I won't accuse her of anything, Margaret interrupted gently. I just want to ask her why she was there. That's all. Evelyn frowned, concern knitting her brow. You think she'll even tell you the truth? Margaret didn't answer. She stood, closing the photo album and clutching it tightly in her hands. Her tea had gone cold, and her heart thudded with uncertainty. But underneath it all was a quiet, growing conviction. I don't know what I think, she said, her voice steadier now. But I can't ignore it. Not this. Evelyn followed her to the door, hesitating before speaking again. Please, Margaret, be careful. We've lived with this pain for so long. I don't want to see you shattered again if this turns out to be nothing. I promise, Margaret said, managing a faint smile. I'll tread lightly. Outside, the sky was still grey, the wind curling through the trees. But as Margaret stepped off the porch and onto the path home, the photograph pressed against her chest, she felt a flicker of energy rise in her. It wasn't just grief that stirred her now, it was resolve, and the smallest, most dangerous thing of all. Suspicion. Margaret Lane hadn't planned on going straight to Dorothy Langford's house. She had told herself she would wait. Give it a day, maybe two. Let the photo settle in her mind. Talk to Evelyn again. Maybe even call the police, though she wasn't sure what she'd report. A suspicion. A photograph. But something stronger had taken root in her chest. That old, aching, maternal instinct. The one that had woken her in the middle of the night for years, long after Emily's room had gone quiet. It whispered that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just grief playing tricks. So instead of heading home, Margaret took a left turn at the end of the block and kept walking. Her feet seemed to know where to go before her mind caught up. The Langford house wasn't far. It was still the same pale blue two-story it had been all those years ago, with hydrangeas flanking the front steps and a wreath on the door that looked like it had been there since Easter. Margaret slowed as she approached, suddenly unsure. What exactly was she going to say? She paused at the sidewalk, staring at the house. Was Dorothy even home? Did she still live here? A lot could change in 27 years. As she hesitated, the sound of footsteps behind her caught her attention. Two women were approaching from the far end of the street, one older, with short silver hair and a familiar posture, the other, younger, maybe in her mid-30s, stylishly dressed, carrying a small reusable shopping bag. The older woman met Margaret's eyes first. And even after all these years, Margaret recognized her instantly. Principal Dorothy Langford. Time had softened her features. The sharp lines of youth were now creases of age, but her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, hadn't changed. Dorothy hesitated, clearly taken aback. "Can I help you?" she asked politely, but there was a slight tension in her voice. Margaret swallowed hard. "I'm Margaret Lane," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Emily's mother." The effect was immediate. Dorothy's composure faltered, just for a second. Her hand twitched against the strap of her purse, and her eyes darted toward the younger woman beside her. "Oh, Mrs. Lane," she said, flustered. Please give me a moment." She turned to the younger woman. "Why don't you go on inside, dear? Make yourself comfortable. I'll be just a minute." The younger woman gave Margaret a curious glance, but nodded and walked up the steps. Dorothy followed her up and fumbled with her keys before stepping inside briefly. Margaret waited on the walkway, her heart thudding. She hadn't expected to feel this nervous. After a minute, Dorothy re-emerged, wiping her hands on her blouse like she'd just washed them. She tried to smile, but it came off as forced. "I wasn't expecting company," she said. "What brings you by?" Margaret took a slow breath. "I found a photograph," she said simply. "One I'd never seen before. From the day of the trip. You were in it." Dorothy's eyes flickered. "Oh? That's surprising." "It surprised me too," Margaret said. She pulled the photo from her purse and held it out. You said you didn't go on the trip, but here you are. Dorothy took the photo, studying it. For a long moment she said nothing, then she nodded slowly. Yes, I remember now. This was taken in the school parking lot, just before they left. Margaret watched her carefully. Are you sure? Dorothy's gaze snapped up. Yes. I had a meeting that morning, I remember clearly. Mr. Thomas and a staff member handled the field trip. I only came out to see them off. Someone must have snapped this picture while I was there. Margaret's jaw tightened. Because when I asked about it years ago, the officer said you had a scheduling conflict, that's why you didn't go. I did, Dorothy said quickly. I had a board meeting. Something came up at the last minute. I'd planned to attend the trip myself, but I couldn't get away. Margaret nodded slowly. So, you were supposed to go. But then you didn't. Dorothy seemed uncomfortable under the weight of the conversation. Mrs. Lane, she said, voice softening, I've answered these questions before. I gave statements. I spoke to the police. What happened that day? It broke all of us. Her expression changed, touched by something like genuine sorrow. I know it's hard. God, it's unbearable. I still see their faces. I still remember every child I lost that day. Margaret looked down at the photo again. But Emily wasn't just lost. She was taken. All of them were. And we've spent nearly 3 decades not knowing anything. There was a long pause. I just want to understand, Margaret said. Why haven't we been told the full truth? Dorothy hesitated. I don't know what you're implying, Mrs. Lane, but I had nothing to do with what happened to your daughter. I would never. I'm not accusing, Margaret interrupted. I'm asking because this picture doesn't fit with what I was told, and maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just an old woman looking too closely at something because she can't let go. Dorothy looked away, her voice quieter now. You're not the first parent to come here on this day. That stopped Margaret cold. What do you mean? Over the years, Dorothy said, some of you come back, asking questions, hoping for answers. I try to be polite. But there's only so much I can give. Margaret's gaze hardened. And what about the young woman I saw with you just now? She looked about the same age Emily would be. Dorothy tensed, just barely. She's a friend, a guest. Nothing to do with any of this. Margaret didn't press, though something about that answer didn't sit right. I should go, she said, slipping the photo back into her purse. Dorothy nodded, stepping back toward her door. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Lane. I mean that. Margaret turned to leave but paused after a few steps. I'll find out the truth, she said without turning around. Even if it's 27 years too late. And with that, she walked away, leaving the house and the ghost of every unanswered question behind her. The clouds had begun to gather by the time Margaret Lane stepped off the bus near the edge of town. She tightened her coat around her and clutched the photo of Emily against her chest, tucked safely in her purse. Every year, on this very date, she made the same quiet pilgrimage to her daughter's grave, even though there was no body beneath the stone, only memories, only loss. She always brought flowers from the same florist shop, always arranged them herself. It was her ritual, her way of keeping connection with a life stolen too soon. The walk from the bus stop to the cemetery was quiet, except for the low rustle of wind through brittle leaves. Margaret's thoughts were heavy, still reeling from her visit to Dorothy Langford's house. The woman's hesitations, her forced smile, the mystery of the young woman in her home, it all lingered like smoke in her chest. She needed a moment of peace. She needed Emily. As she passed through the iron gates of the cemetery, a sense of calm settled over her. The grounds were empty, as they usually were at this hour. The sky was a bruised grey, and a fine mist had begun to fall, soft enough to feel like breath on her cheeks. Margaret walked the familiar path toward the section of the cemetery reserved for children. A soft ache pulsed in her chest. She had walked this path so many times, she could trace it in her sleep. Then she saw her. A young woman, standing motionless near the row of children's graves, hands clasped, her head bowed. She wore a dark coat and boots, and her hair fell in gentle waves around her face. Her figure was unfamiliar, yet something about her stance felt oddly known. Margaret slowed. The woman wasn't just visiting, she was mourning. Deeply. Her shoulders shook, and from where Margaret stood, she could see the woman was crying. Silently. The way someone does when they've done it 1,000 times before. She didn't want to intrude. She almost turned away. But then the woman looked up, and her eyes locked with Margaret's. Both froze. Margaret took a tentative step forward. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you, she said gently. The young woman wiped her tears quickly and straightened, forcing composure. We met earlier, didn't we? Margaret continued. At Dorothy Langford's house. The woman's lips parted, but she said nothing. Margaret took a cautious breath. I don't mean to pry, She gestured softly toward the headstone. You knew one of the children? The woman looked down, her grip tightening around something in her hands, a small framed photograph, weathered and wrapped in a plastic sleeve to keep it from the elements. Yes, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I come here every year to grieve. Margaret nodded, understanding all too well. So do I. Emily Lane was my daughter. The woman's expression shifted, flickering with something that wasn't quite surprise, more like recognition, held at bay. Her fingers curled more tightly around the photo she held. Margaret's eyes drifted to the stone the woman had been standing beside. She couldn't quite see the name from her angle, but she recognized the section. These were the children who had vanished with Emily. Their stones were symbolic. No remains, just names and dates carved in granite. Tributes to what was lost and never recovered. Then she saw the photograph more clearly. It was old. Faded, but unmistakable. It was Emily. Margaret's breath caught. That's her, she said, stunned. Where did you get that? The woman stepped back instinctively. Please, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't mean any harm. Margaret's mind raced. You knew her. You knew Emily? Silence. A long, heavy silence. The woman looked away, then back again. Her eyes were glassy with tears. I'm sorry, she whispered. I shouldn't be here. Wait, Margaret said quickly, reaching out. Please, if you knew her, if you know anything, I've spent 27 years not knowing. You can't imagine what that's like. The woman trembled. I do know, she said quietly. More than you think. Margaret stepped closer, slowly, as though the wrong movement might scare her off. Her heart was pounding in her ears. Who are you? She asked gently. Please, tell me. The woman hesitated, her jaw tightening, her eyes brimming again. Then she whispered, I'm one of them. I was on that bus. The air around Margaret seemed to vanish. Her knees weakened, and she had to steady herself on a nearby stone. You, she choked. You were one of the missing children? The woman nodded, and Margaret's voice came in a broken whisper. Emily, do you know what happened to her? The woman's face twisted in pain, and for a long moment she didn't answer. Finally, she said, Not here. Not now. Please, just give me a little time. Margaret didn't press further. She could see the torment etched into the woman's face. Whoever she was, she carried years of silence and suffering. Still, she had to ask one more thing. What's your name? The woman's voice was barely above a whisper. Hannah. Margaret felt the name ripple through her memory. It was on one of the stones, one of the lost. But Hannah wasn't lost. She was standing right in front of her. Alive. Margaret stood in stunned silence as Hannah turned and walked away into the mist. She didn't run. She didn't hide. But she didn't look back either. Margaret remained rooted in place, her heart racing. For the first time in 27 years, she had a name. A face. A thread of truth. And she wasn't about to let it slip away. It had started to rain by the time Margaret Lane returned home. A soft drizzle, steady and cold, soaked through her coat as she stood at her front porch, key trembling in her hand. But she barely noticed the chill. Her mind was still at the cemetery, still with the young woman who had spoken her name with such quiet pain. Hannah. Margaret had gone there seeking peace. Instead, she'd found a survivor. A living answer to a question that had haunted her for nearly 3 decades. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her kitchen, the lights dim, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea that she never drank. The house was silent, except for the occasional tap of rain against the window. And her thoughts were anything but silent. The next day, Hannah came to her. It was late afternoon when Margaret heard a soft knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. No deliveries, no appointments. When she opened it, the sight of Hannah standing there, wet from the rain, made her heart seize. I didn't know where else to go, Hannah said quietly, eyes downcast. Margaret stepped aside. Come in, please. She led Hannah to the living room, offered her a towel and a cup of tea. They sat in silence for a few moments. The air between them was heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. I saw you with Principal Langford, Margaret finally said gently. You were at her house. Hannah nodded, her fingers gripping the teacup tightly. She's the only person who knew I was still alive. Margaret's breath caught. She knew? All this time? Hannah's voice was soft, steady, but each word fell like a stone in water. Yes, I escaped when I was 15. I found my way back over the border, alone. I didn't know who to trust, what to say. I was scared. I was broken. Margaret listened, her heart pounding. I found her, Dorothy, through an old school flyer I had kept. I don't know why I went to her. Maybe I thought she'd help me get back to my parents. But when I told her who I was, she panicked. She said I couldn't go to the police, that it would only make things worse. That the other families would suffer more if I stirred up old wounds. She convinced you to stay silent, Margaret said. She didn't force me, Hannah replied quickly. But she offered me a way to disappear. She paid for a small apartment, gave me money for groceries, even helped me enroll in online classes. I think part of her really believed she was doing the right thing, that if I just stayed quiet, everyone would eventually heal. Margaret could hardly breathe. But what about your parents? Did they ever know? Hannah shook her head. They visit the cemetery in the morning. I go in the afternoon. I can't face them. I've tried. But I'm not the daughter they remember. I'm someone else now. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. You're not someone else. You're still their child. You're still you. You survived something unthinkable. Hannah's shoulders tensed. And then, for the first time, she told Margaret the whole truth, what really happened on that school trip. They never intended to take us to Big Ben Park, Hannah began, her voice raw. The bus driver wasn't who we thought he was. He was part of it. So was someone from the staff. Not Mr. Thomas, though. He tried to stop it. Margaret's grip tightened around her cup. They rerouted the bus, told us we were making a special stop first, but the road kept going. Eventually, we were somewhere unfamiliar, dusty, empty. We ended up at this compound, just across the Mexican border. Armed men were waiting for us. She paused, closing her eyes. Mr. Thomas fought back. They shot him. The bus driver too. We saw it happen. Some of the kids screamed, some froze. I couldn't move. Margaret's stomach turned. They divided us, boys and girls. After that, it gets blurry. We were taken to different places. The girls, we were sold, used, moved again and again. Some didn't survive the first few days. They gave us injections to keep us quiet or compliant. Emily, her voice cracked. Margaret's whole body tensed. What about Emily? Hannah looked down. They gave her too much. She didn't wake up. The words hit Margaret like a punch to the chest. For a moment, the room tilted. She closed her eyes, willing herself to stay upright. I'm so sorry, Hannah whispered. I tried to help her. I held her hand until they made me let go. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I was scared. Margaret reached out, placing her hand gently over Hannah's. You're telling me now. That's what matters. They sat like that for a while, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but shared. Sacred. Finally, Margaret spoke. You have to go to the police, Hannah. You have to tell them everything. Hannah's eyes widened. Dorothy said it would destroy everything. She said I'd only cause more pain. No, Margaret said firmly. The pain is already here. It's been here for 27 years. You can't cause more than what we've already lived through, but you can give us the truth. You can give other families the chance to know what happened to their children. Hannah looked away, biting her lip. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Margaret squeezed her hand. You are? You survived. That alone means you're stronger than most people ever will be. Hannah didn't respond right away, but slowly she nodded. I'll think about it, she said softly. That's all I can promise. Margaret nodded. That's all I ask. And deep inside, for the first time since the day her daughter disappeared, Margaret Lane felt something stir. Not hope, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become hope. Someday. The following morning, the air in Margaret Lane's kitchen felt different. A kind of stillness hovered, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She had barely slept the night before. After Hannah's confession, her mind had refused to rest, spinning with details too dark to comprehend and decisions too important to delay. She sat at the kitchen table, the worn photograph of Emily beside her cup of coffee, untouched and going cold. The image, once a source of comfort, now looked like a question she had finally begun to answer. But not alone. Not anymore. A knock came at the door. This time, Margaret didn't hesitate. She opened it to find Hannah standing there, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. Her hands clutched the same small framed photo she had held at the cemetery. "I couldn't sleep," Hannah said. "I kept thinking about what you said. About the other families, about the truth." Margaret stepped aside, letting her in. "You don't have to rush anything," she said gently. "It's a lot to carry." Hannah shook her head. "No, I've carried it long enough. It's time." They sat together for only a few minutes. Hannah sipped a few mouthfuls of tea, her fingers trembling as she held the cup. Then, with a quiet exhale, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. "I still have the number," she said. "I saved it when I was younger, just in case." Margaret didn't speak. She simply reached across the table and gave Hannah's hand a reassuring squeeze. Hannah stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, a voice. "This is Officer Daniels." Margaret recognized it immediately. He had been the lead investigator back in 1996 when the children first disappeared. She had called him so many times in those early years that his voice had once felt like the last rope she was clinging to. "Officer Daniels," Hannah said, her voice steady but soft. "My name is Hannah Collins. I'm one of the missing students from the school trip 27 years ago. I'm ready to talk." There was silence on the other end. Then a rustle, the sound of a chair scraping. "Where are you?" the officer asked. "Margaret Lane's house," she replied. I'm safe, but I can't keep this inside anymore." "We'll be there shortly," he said. "Please stay put." Hannah ended the call, her hands shaking as she placed the phone on the table. Margaret reached out instinctively and took both of her hands in hers. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "This is the bravest thing anyone could do." Hannah didn't reply, but the tears in her eyes said everything. Within the hour, 2 unmarked vehicles arrived quietly on the street. The officers who stepped out weren't the rookies fresh from training. They were seasoned, deliberate, their expressions grave. One of them was Officer Daniels himself. His hair had gone grey, his shoulders stooped slightly, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He entered the home with respect, nodding at Margaret and taking in the sight of Hannah with barely concealed astonishment. "It's really you," he said. "Yes," Hannah whispered. "It's me." "We'll need to take you both to the station," he said. "We'll protect your identity. You'll be safe." Margaret nodded. "I'll go too." She's not doing this alone. At the station, everything moved quickly. Hannah was led to a quiet interview room, her photo still clutched in her hand. Margaret, meanwhile, waited in the hallway with Evelyn and Robert, who had arrived after receiving a brief, hurried message from Margaret. The weight of what was happening hadn't quite sunk in for them, but their presence was a silent testament to how deeply they, too, needed answers. When Officer Daniels emerged, he looked 10 years older. "She's talking," he said. "She's told us enough to reopen the case, and she's naming names." Margaret stood. "Dorothy Langford?" He nodded grimly. "We've already dispatched a unit to her home." The words didn't feel real. After so many years of whispers, false leads and silence, something was finally happening. It felt surreal, fragile. Then, the sharp, unmistakable sound of sirens sliced through the air. Less than an hour later, Principal Dorothy Langford was escorted into the station in handcuffs. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her hair pulled back too tightly as if trying to control something that had long since unraveled. She didn't resist, didn't argue. But when her eyes met Margaret's in the hallway, she paused. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible. But Margaret didn't respond. She simply stared. Sorry wasn't enough. Inside the interrogation room, Hannah's statement was being recorded. She spoke of the compound, the smuggling, the injections. She named the men who had taken the girls. She named the front organizations used to launder the money. And when asked how she knew Dorothy was involved, she explained everything. She arranged the trip. She picked the driver. And when I escaped, she told me to stay quiet, to disappear. She said it was mercy, but it was control. Margaret listened through the glass, her heart in her throat. There was no undoing the years they had lost, no way to bring Emily or Grace back. But the truth could still matter. Officer Daniels stepped into the hall once more. "We're filing formal charges," he said. "Human trafficking, child endangerment, obstruction, dozens of counts." Evelyn began to cry. Robert wrapped his arm around her, tears streaking silently down his own cheeks. Margaret didn't cry. Not yet. She just stared at the closed door where Hannah remained. She had waited 27 years for this moment. And though it came wrapped in pain, it also brought something she hadn't dared to believe she'd ever feel again. Justice. It was only the beginning, but it was something real. The waiting room at the police station felt colder than usual. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale glow over the weary faces of Margaret Lane, Evelyn Brooks, and Robert Brooks. They had been sitting in silence for over an hour, their nerves frayed and their eyes locked on the hallway that led to the interrogation rooms. Somewhere behind that door, Hannah was still talking, still confessing, still tearing open the past with every word she shared. Then finally, the door opened. Officer Daniels stepped into the room with a grim, drawn expression. He looked like a man who had aged another 10 years in the last 60 minutes. The folder in his hands was thick, heavy, and when he spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Principal Langford has confessed," he said. Margaret stiffened. Evelyn reached for Robert's hand. Daniels glanced between them. "I want to prepare you. What she admitted to, it's worse than we expected." No one spoke. Margaret only nodded once, her jaw tight. Daniels continued. "She organized the entire trip. From the selection of the driver to the fake itinerary. The location the children were supposed to visit, Big Bend, it was never the real destination. It was a cover." Evelyn whispered, "Why?" Daniels took a slow breath. "She owed money, a lot of money, gambling debts, loans from people you don't borrow from unless you're desperate. And when the pressure got too much, she made a deal. She agreed to hand over a group of children in exchange for wiping her debt clean." The words landed like stones in their chests. Evelyn gasped. Robert looked away, jaw clenched. Margaret stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Daniels continued, his voice shaking slightly now. "The plan was simple and horrifying. The bus driver was one of them. So was a man posing as administrative support. They were never going to return with the children. Mr. Thomas, the classroom teacher, he wasn't in on it. He fought back. And they killed him. Margaret closed her eyes, her breath catching. And the children? Daniels hesitated before answering. They were transported across the border into Mexico. From there, they were separated by gender. The girls were sold into exploitation, used by criminal networks that operated across the region. The boys, most were trafficked into labor camps overseas. A sharp sob broke from Evelyn. Robert pulled her into his arms, his own eyes filling with tears. Margaret didn't cry. Not yet. Her hands were locked together so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Daniels lowered his voice. Langford said she didn't know everything that would happen to them, but she knew enough. She knew it was a death sentence. And she let it happen? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. She let it happen, and she lived with that knowledge for 27 years. Margaret stood up slowly. Her legs felt heavy, but her back was straight. What about Emily and Grace? Daniels swallowed. We asked Hannah. She told us Emily didn't survive long. They gave her something, some kind of sedative. Too much. She died shortly after they arrived. Grace passed not long after. Similar reasons. Evelyn collapsed into Robert's arms, a broken sound escaping her. Margaret felt something twist in her chest, as if her heart had turned inside out. She covered her mouth, trying to steady her breathing. Daniels gave them a moment before continuing. Hannah said that over the years, she was moved several times. She lost contact with the others, but she believes some might still be alive. She doesn't know where. And she's deeply traumatized. She trusted Langford because Langford helped her survive after she escaped. She manipulated Hannah, convinced her that silence was the only way to heal. Margaret's voice cut through the silence, quiet but sharp. That wasn't healing. That was hiding. Daniels nodded solemnly. We agree, and now, with Hannah's statement and Langford's confession, we're reopening the case. We've already reached out to federal authorities and law enforcement in Mexico. We're going after the trafficking ring responsible. A long silence followed. Then Margaret spoke again. What happens to Hannah? We're placing her under protection, Daniels said. There's a risk now that she's come forward, but she'll be safe. We'll make sure of it. Evelyn wiped her eyes. Will the other families know? Will they finally get answers too? Daniels looked at her, compassion softening his voice. Yes. We'll contact every family. They deserve to know the truth, no matter how painful. Margaret turned toward the hallway, staring at the door where Langford had disappeared earlier. She destroyed so many lives, she said softly. And for what? Money? Daniels didn't answer. The room was silent once more, except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. Margaret sat down again, slowly, her strength returning in waves. The grief was there. It always would be. But now, it had shape, form, and a name. It was no longer just a disappearance. It was a crime. A choice. A betrayal. And now, it was finally being answered. Not with vengeance, but with justice. It was just past sunset when Margaret Lane and Evelyn Brooks stepped out of the police station. The air was damp and cool, the rain having passed, but leaving behind a faint mist that curled around the streetlights like smoke. The city felt quieter than usual, as if it too was holding space for the weight of what had just been revealed. They walked together in silence, shoulder to shoulder, their heels tapping softly against the sidewalk. Robert followed a few paces behind, giving them space, understanding without needing words. They had always imagined this moment would be different. For 27 years, both women had clung to a fragile hope, perhaps naive, perhaps necessary, that one day Emily and Grace might walk through their doors again, older, changed, but alive. And while logic had whispered otherwise, the heart often refused to listen to logic. The heart needed something to hold on to, even if it was only a sliver. But now, there were no more slivers, no more unanswered questions. Only truth. And the truth, as it turned out, was even harder to carry than the uncertainty. "She didn't suffer long," Evelyn said quietly, breaking the silence. Margaret nodded, her eyes fixed on the pavement ahead. "That's what they said." "And Grace?" Evelyn's voice cracked. "Similar story. Just too much medicine, too quickly." "I know," Margaret replied. "It should help." "But it doesn't." Evelyn stopped walking, and Margaret turned to her. They stood under the yellow wash of a street lamp, their faces drawn and pale. Evelyn's eyes welled with tears. "I used to tell myself she was somewhere warm," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "Somewhere safe. Maybe a family had taken her in. Maybe she was waiting for the right moment to come back." "I told myself the same thing," Margaret said. "Every time the doorbell rang, every phone call, every unknown number. Part of me always wondered if it was her." They stood in silence, letting the words settle. Margaret took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear, faint and blinking through the haze. For years, she had imagined Emily beneath the same sky, somewhere. Now she knew that Emily hadn't seen the stars again after that trip. That the last sky her daughter had looked up to was foreign. That her final breath had been stolen by people who saw her as nothing more than a transaction. That knowledge carved a hole inside her that nothing could ever fill. But it also closed a door that had remained painfully ajar for too long. "Do you remember her laugh?" Margaret asked suddenly. Evelyn's face softened. "Of course I do." "She used to tilt her head all the way back," Margaret said, smiling through her tears, like the joke was too big for her to hold in. "Grace was the opposite," Evelyn said. "She'd try to stifle it, cover her mouth with her hands, but her eyes always gave her away." They chuckled softly, the laughter catching in their throats like dry leaves. But it was something. A memory not dulled by time, not touched by evil. "Maybe that's what we have to hold on to now," Evelyn said. "Not how they died, but how they lived." Margaret nodded, her voice quiet. "We gave them everything we could while they were here. And we never stopped looking for them after they were gone. That has to mean something." "It does," Evelyn said. "It means they were loved." They resumed walking, this time more slowly. The grief didn't feel any lighter, but it had a new shape, one they could begin to understand. When they reached the florist's shop, still open though dimly lit, Margaret paused at the window. The bouquets inside were arranged neatly in the coolers, delicate petals tucked into paper sleeves. A memory stirred. "We were here just a few days ago," she said, mostly to herself. "Choosing flowers for empty graves." Evelyn joined her at the window. They won't be empty anymore. Margaret looked at her. We know, Evelyn said. Now we know. And Margaret understood what she meant. It wasn't about remains or physical evidence. It was about truth. The names. The details. The timeline. It was about the fact that someone had finally said it aloud. Emily is gone. Grace is gone. Not missing. Not taken. Not lost. Gone. It was the kind of finality that shattered your world. But it was also the only kind that let healing begin. When they reached the parking lot, Robert opened the car door for them. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He simply placed his hand on Evelyn's shoulder and nodded toward Margaret, his eyes filled with quiet sorrow. Margaret hesitated before getting in. What happens now? She asked. Evelyn looked up at her. Now we grieve all over again. But this time, we grieve with the truth. Margaret nodded. And finally, after 27 years, she let the tears fall. Not the desperate tears of a mother who doesn't know. Not the angry tears of a woman demanding answers, but the quiet, aching tears of someone who has been handed the truth and now must carry it forward. That night, when she returned home, Margaret didn't light candles or put on soft music like she usually did when sadness came knocking. She simply sat in Emily's room. The posters on the wall had faded. The books on the shelf had gathered dust. But the scent, somehow, still lingered faintly. Vanilla lotion, old paper. Childhood. She pulled open the drawer of Emily's desk and found her old diary. The lock was broken long ago. She opened it to the first page. Today, I got picked to go on the science field trip. Mom said she'd pack extra snacks. I hope Grace brings those jelly candies I like. Margaret smiled and sobbed and smiled again. Because even now, especially now, Emily was still with her. In her words, in her laughter. In every breath Margaret took from this day forward. The next morning, Margaret Lane stood at the edge of her garden, staring at the rose bushes she and Emily had planted together so many years ago. The petals were beginning to wilt under the autumn air, their once vibrant pinks and reds now softer, muted. And yet they still stood, still reaching toward the sun. Much like Margaret herself. Inside her home, the landline rang, a sound she rarely heard anymore. She stepped back into the kitchen and picked it up. Mrs. Lane? Came Officer Daniel's voice on the other end. Yes, I'm here. I wanted to call personally, he said. As of this morning, the case is officially reopened. The files have been pulled from archives and new resources have been assigned. This time, we're not stopping until every question has an answer. Margaret felt her knees weaken slightly, but she remained upright. Thank you, she said, barely more than a whisper. It means more than you know. We've also spoken to the federal task force, Daniels continued. They're working with Mexican authorities. It'll be slow and it won't be easy, but there's already movement. Margaret pressed the phone to her ear more tightly. And Hannah? She's been placed into our temporary witness protection program, he said. She's safe and she's cooperating. Her testimony was extensive, painful to listen to, but critical. It confirms details we never had before. A long pause followed. Then Daniels added softly, She asked if you were doing okay. Margaret's throat tightened. She doesn't need to worry about me. I just want her to heal. We've assigned her a counselor, Daniels said. someone experienced with trauma cases, and we'll continue to protect her as this unfolds. She's incredibly brave. She is, Margaret agreed. Stronger than most people realize. When the call ended, Margaret stood by the window for a long time, watching the street. She thought of Evelyn, probably sitting at her kitchen table with Robert, talking through everything over a cup of strong black coffee. She thought of the other families, names she hadn't said aloud in years. The Carsons, the Nguyens, the Parkers. Each with a child lost, each with a scar that never healed. They would all be getting calls today. Across town, at the precinct, officers gathered in the briefing room, combing through records long buried under layers of bureaucracy. Boxes were opened, photos re-examined, maps unrolled on tables. New names were being added to the suspect list: smugglers, transporters. The financial trail from Principal Langford's debts had already begun to lead to other figures, dangerous ones. Meanwhile, Hannah Collins sat in a safe house, under watch. She had barely slept, but when she did, her dreams were sharper. Memories, yes, but not only of pain. Some were of before, of the bus, of Emily's laughter, of Grace humming softly under her breath, of Mr. Thomas telling a corny joke to calm them down. Fragments of light amidst the darkness. Now, in the safety of a plain apartment, with a locked door and a kind-eyed officer sitting just outside, Hannah began writing. Her counselor had encouraged it, said that sometimes the words that were hardest to speak could be the ones that helped the most when written. She wrote about the compound, about the girls whose names she never learned, about the days without sunlight and the nights without sleep. And she wrote about Margaret, about the way she had looked at her, not with judgment, not with fear, but with something Hannah hadn't felt in years. Belief. Someone believed her. For the first time since she had escaped, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Back at the police station, Officer Daniels called a press briefing. The room was full of reporters, many of them young enough that they had been children themselves when the disappearance had first made headlines. Now, they sat with pens poised, cameras ready, expecting the usual vague statement. What they got, instead, was something else. "This is no longer a cold case," Daniels said firmly. "Thanks to new testimony and a full confession, we have reopened the investigation into the disappearance of the 15 students from Willow Creek Elementary School in 1996. Flashes went off. Hands shot up, but Daniels continued. "We have confirmed that the disappearance was part of a coordinated trafficking operation involving multiple individuals. We now know that the field trip was a planned abduction. We have identified persons of interest both in the US and across the Mexican border, and we are working closely with international law enforcement to pursue them." Gasps rippled through the room. "We know this is difficult for the families," he added, "and while some answers will be painful, we believe they deserve the truth. Every family does." Margaret watched the conference from her living room. She didn't need the volume to hear what was being said. She saw it in the way Daniels spoke, in the stillness of the room. She saw the headlines scroll across the bottom of the screen. Willow Creek disappearance case reopened. Survivor comes forward. And then beneath it, trafficking network suspected, arrest made, more to come. She turned off the television and let the quiet wash over her. This wasn't the end, but it was finally, a beginning. A beginning for justice, for the children, for the survivors, for Hannah. and for all the parents who had waited far too long for a knock on the door that never came. A week had passed since the press conference, but for Margaret Lane, time still moved in a strange, quiet rhythm. The days didn't blur together the way they used to. They felt more present now, more defined. Each morning, she awoke not to uncertainty, but to truth. Painful truth, yes, but truth nonetheless. The photo of Emily no longer hung on the corner of the mirror. It had been moved. Framed, centered, placed carefully on the mantel of the fireplace, a space of honor, not mourning. Margaret had added a single white rose in a vase beside it. Every evening, as she turned off the lights and locked the doors, she paused there, just for a few seconds, to say goodnight. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Evelyn and Robert came by. The three of them sat in Margaret's living room, sipping chamomile tea, the television off, the windows open to let in the early October breeze. "I spoke to Hannah this morning," Margaret said, cradling her cup. She sounded stronger, brighter. Evelyn smiled. "That's good. That's really good." "She says the counsellor's helping," Margaret added, "and the officers check in every few hours. She's not scared anymore." Evelyn nodded, her eyes distant. "I've thought about writing her. I don't know what I'd say, but I feel like I should." "You should," Margaret said gently. "She needs to know we don't blame her. That what she did, coming forward, was the bravest thing any of us have seen." Robert set his cup down. "You know, I was thinking the same thing last night. How she stood up there in that interview room, telling strangers the worst things that ever happened to her. And she did it not for herself, but for us, for our kids, for the families." Evelyn wiped a tear from her cheek. "She gave us something we never had before, a place to put our grief." Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes. A place, a reason, a name." They sat in silence for a while. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that comes when people know each other's pain intimately. A silence that comforts, not avoids. Then Margaret reached beside her chair and picked up a manila folder. She handed it to Evelyn. "What's this?" Evelyn asked, opening it carefully. "Documents," Margaret replied. "I've been in touch with a non-profit that supports survivors of human trafficking. They've offered to help Hannah relocate, start over under a new name if she wants, and I want to help fund it." Evelyn looked up in surprise. "We both know she has a long road ahead," Margaret continued, "but she shouldn't walk it alone." Evelyn's voice was soft. "You want to help her build a new life." "She never got the chance to live the old one," Margaret said. "None of our kids did, and we can't change that. But we can help someone who survived." Robert reached out and placed his hand gently over Margaret's. "Let us help too." Later that day, they drove together to the cemetery. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. The sun had just begun to dip behind the trees, casting long golden rays across the neatly kept rows of stone. There was a new plaque there now, installed just 2 days before, organized by the police and funded by private donors. It read, "In memory of the Willow Creek 15. Their voices were silenced. Their names will never be forgotten. 1996-2023. Margaret stood before it, a bouquet of autumn flowers in her hand. She placed them gently at the base of the marker, alongside other arrangements left by parents, siblings, and even strangers who had heard the story and felt compelled to honor them. Evelyn knelt beside Grace's headstone, brushing away a few fallen leaves. "I used to dream that she'd come back someday," she whispered. "Now I dream that she's at peace. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. "She is," she said, "and so are we. Maybe not fully, maybe not forever, but for the first time, we're close." As they stood to leave, Margaret caught sight of a figure in the distance, a young woman in a grey coat, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She stood quietly at the edge of the memorial site, not drawing attention to herself, but not hiding either. It was Hannah. Margaret met her eyes and nodded. Hannah nodded back. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That small exchange carried more than words ever could. That night, back at home, Margaret sat once more at Emily's desk. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen, writing slowly, carefully. "Dear Emily, today I learned that love isn't just about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go of fear, of anger, of what-ifs. I will always miss you. That will never change, but I no longer have to wonder. I know where your story ended. And now I can begin mine again. With love, Mom." She folded the letter and tucked it into the diary they had once shared. She closed the cover with both hands, exhaled deeply, and looked out the window. The stars were out, and for the first time in 27 years, Margaret Lane looked up at the night sky, not with a question in her heart, but with peace. Sometimes the truth takes decades, but it still matters. This story reminds us that grief doesn't fade just because time has passed. For parents like Margaret and Evelyn, the pain of losing a child never truly goes away. It only changes shape. And yet, it is in that quiet endurance, in the refusal to forget, that we find something extraordinary: strength. Sometimes justice takes years. Answers come slowly. But the pursuit of truth, no matter how long it takes, is a form of love. It says to the world, "My child mattered. What happened mattered." And just as powerful is the reminder that healing is possible, not because the pain disappears, but because it is finally named, understood, and witnessed. When someone dares to speak the truth, like Hannah did, it becomes a light in the dark for others still waiting. No matter our age, it's never too late to seek truth, and it's never too late to be a voice for those who can't speak for themselves.